All right, so let's get started. Welcome everyone. The presentation is about to begin. This session will be recorded and will last 60 minutes. Please keep your mic muted during presentation and turn off web cameras. If you have a question or a comment, enter it in the chat box during the presentation, and your question will be addressed by the presenters at the end. If you're on a phone, you'll be given an opportunity during the Q&A time to voice your questions and comments. All participants in today's event will have access to the recorded version, which will be available within 2 business days after the live event. TESOL International Association's Speech, Pronunciation, and Listening Interest section is pleased to present this webinar titled Empirical Approaches to Measuring Intelligibility of Different Varieties of English. Our speakers today are Kim Kang, Ron Thompson, and Megan Moran. We're very pleased to welcome all of you to this webinar. My name is Sinem Sonsat Hegelheimer, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. And now it is my pleasure to give the floor to our presenters. Welcome to the program. Let's get started.
Okay, can we start?
Yes.
Hi, this is Kim Kang at Northern Arizona University, and maybe let's introduce ourselves first.
Yes.
And Ron, do you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Ron Thompson at Brock University in Canada.
And I'm Megan Moran at Northern Arizona University.
Okay, hello everyone again. I hope everyone is staying healthy and safe. And let's see whether this, okay. Once again, on behalf of Ron and Megan, I would like to say special thanks to SPLIS for giving us this opportunity so that in this challenging time, we can still share our research study and its findings and talk about the importance of speech and pronunciation with the TESOL community. And also we'd like to thank ETS for their generous support for our project. Okay, so today we'll start with intelligibility in world Englishes and talk about different measures of intelligibility, just like our title, and introduce our study published in 2018, Language Learning, and talk about the discussion and implications at the end. So we know the role of English as an international language has introduced different perspectives to the field of TESOL. And this mutual intelligibility is a key for successful communication in global context. The goal of global intelligibility has been emphasized over mastery of a particular native accent. Also, the ownership of English no longer belongs just to the inner circle countries. When it comes to this world Englishes, according to the Cartruse's 3 concentric circles, we know we have an inner circle, outer circles, and the expanding circle. But the English is spoken by far more non-native speakers than the native speakers. Also, the vast majority of teachers of English as a second or the foreign language in the world today are the non-native teachers. That's how our intelligibility comes along. Let's talk about the state of English in the world and the intelligibility. In the second language pronunciation, the importance of a mutual intelligibility has been emphasized both in classroom and the assessment context. Researchers have aimed to determine the specific segmental or suprasegmental features that affect intelligibility and assessment scores for listeners. But the defining and operationalizing intelligibility is known to be complicated. Okay, so speech constructs. In second language speech, there are 3 speech constructs that have been often discussed. These constructs are distinct and somewhat interrelated, but all equally important to listeners' perception. Comprehensibility refers to perception of how easy it is to understand an utterance. Accentedness refers to perception of how different a speaker's accent is from the target language. Intelligibility is defined as how much the listener actually understands of the intended message. Although the intelligibility and the comprehensibility are closely related, it's not the same thing, and accent is partially independent of these concepts. Again, accent means phonological difference, but the intelligibility refers to the extent to which a listener understands an utterance. The graph on the right shows the ratings of utterance.
İşte.
Having 100% intelligibility proved by 18 listeners' transcription. But the accent ratings for these utterances are all over the scale from 1 to 9. That is, a second language speech can be completely intelligible, but can be heavily accented. Then how can we promote this intelligibility in the world English's context? I'm going to share a couple of studies that I completed recently. There has been an attempt to incorporate different varieties of world Englishes in the EFL classrooms. My colleague and I, we did an intervention study in Beijing, China, with over 100 college students. About 50 experimental students were exposed to world English's varieties, and the other 50 students were not in their listening skill classrooms. After their 8 weeks of lessons, only the experimental group exposed to the accent varieties improved their listening comprehension scores when they took their listening comprehension test prepared with accented speech. This study finding suggests that the exposure to accent varieties does help listeners' listening comprehension, especially for the intelligible speech in general. However, when we did a recent study, a survey study with 117 ESL and EFL teachers pretty much all over the world, the reality is far from our research suggestion. Our finding shows that most of the English teachers are still not comfortable with non-native speakers models and don't want to introduce them in their classrooms, just because students still prefer their inner circle prestigious models. Accordingly, we still need to take these intelligibility issues pretty seriously. In today's talk, especially, we want to talk about how to measure intelligibility of different varieties of English. When it comes to different measures of intelligibility, there are largely two categories. One would be functional testing measures, the other would be listener's judgment. The first, functional testing, means how well a listener actually understands a speaker, and is often operationalized through transcription test, close test, or true-false test. Applied linguists tend to use this functional testing method, and so did our current study. On the other hand, the listener judgment method is about how well a listener thinks she or he understands a speaker by using a Likert type scale. What are the factors that affect intelligibility? Well, the working memory can play a role, as listeners with a better working memory can perform better on a transcription test, or if listener has a contextual knowledge or a semantic context provided, they seem to perform better. Okay, what are the common intelligibility measures? First, many of us know the transcription method. Listeners either ask to transcribe full utterances or ask to transcribe the target words. Its focus is on intelligibility at a local level by calculating the percentages of words in an utterance. Utterances are often kept short to avoid associations with working memory, which I just mentioned. But the drawback of this approach is that each word is assigned equal weight, but each word may not be weighted equally when a listener hears an utterance. And a listener doesn't necessarily need to understand every single word either. So the understanding of every single word may be less important than understanding an overall meaning of the message. What about the scalar judgment? In this method, listeners are asked to assign an intelligibility value based on scalar points. Here, listeners have to consider if words are pronounced correctly or what percentage of words are understood. This method can be controversial because it is somewhat similar to the comprehensibility measure, which is a partially related but independent construct, which we just talked about. The next method is true-false sentences. In this method, listeners of true-false sentences have access to background knowledge in addition to linguistic understanding. So for example, a yacht is a type of boat. In this case, listeners must understand the words in the sentence and know what the word a yacht is to answer this correctly. If a person provides an incorrect answer, we don't really know if that listener lacks the background knowledge or just misunderstands the word. This is especially true if the listeners are non-native speakers of English. The next is a nonsense sentence. It is often used in a speech-language pathology to look at the clarity of disordered speech, or in a text-to-speech synthesis intelligibility test in speech science. It is also used in speech technology and audiology to investigate the interlanguage speech intelligibility benefit. It ensures that the listeners are free of semantic context, and it focuses on word-level intelligibility rather than the global intelligibility. In this measure, listeners are provided semantically meaningless but syntactically accurate sentences, and lexical items and the number of syllables are controlled. Intelligibility is determined as the percentages of content words correctly identified by the listener. But the drawback of this approach is the bottom-up process, which doesn't consider the global understanding of the message or the understanding or the utterance. So the example would be our deaf ads traced my aunt. So nothing makes sense in this case. If you look at the relationship between the semantic context and understanding of the speech, this nonsense approach can be the lowest on the left in this continuum. Okay, the last intelligibility measure is low pass filtering, in which it is adapted from mostly first language intelligibility research. In this technique, semantic content is masked, but not many second language intelligibility studies have practiced this method. Some research utilizing this technique includes infant or foreigner directed speech, prosodic information, or intonation patterns in foreign accented speech. We will explain more of this method in the following study, which Megan's going to explain in details. Okay, Megan, you ready?
Yeah, thank you, Okim. So I'd like to move on now to the study we'll focus on most today, and that is Kong, Thompson, and Moran 2018, published in Language Learning. This study is called Empirical Approaches to Measuring the Intelligibility of Different Varieties of English in Predicting Listener Comprehension. It came out of an extended project on the intelligibility of different varieties of world Englishes, funded generously by the Educational Testing Service. If you're interested in learning more about the study and its results, I encourage you to look at Kong, Thompson, and Moran 2018b and 2019 as well. In this study, we investigated how segmental and suprasegmental phonological features of L2 speech relate to different measurements of intelligibility in different varieties of English. We also looked at how different measurements of overall intelligibility in different varieties of English correlate with listeners' comprehension scores in TOEFL-type listening comprehension tests recorded by the same speakers. 18 speakers were chosen from 6 different countries representing Kotru's concentric circles: the US and England, India and South Africa, and Mexico and China. These speakers spanned a range of intelligibility as determined by trained raters' judgments. They were all current professors or graduate students that met certain criteria. They sounded like lecturers, sounded like genuine speakers of a given accent, handled the terminology of the scripts fluently and appeared to be experts in the field, and they had the mature voice quality and pitch of a professional or academic speaker. Speakers underwent a very strict selection process. We chose speakers who were homogeneous in their accent variety, but for the outer and expanding circles, they had a range of accents. That is, from each of those 4 countries, one of the speakers represented a 1, meaning that they were lightly accented and highly comprehensible. One represented a 3, signifying mid-level accent and mid-comprehensibility, and one represented a 5, meaning highly accented and less comprehensible. In the end, this resulted in a total of 10 highly comprehensible speakers, 4 mid-comprehensibility speakers, and 4 low comprehensibility speakers. 60 listeners were chosen from the same 6 countries as the speakers. The listeners were senior undergraduate or early graduate students, and non-native listeners had received 100 or better on the TOEFL exam. The listeners completed a brief demographic questionnaire and 3 separate sessions of speech evaluations. We chose to include 5 measures of intelligibility, some of which, as we saw, are common to the field of applied linguistics research, while others are more commonly used in related disciplines. These were true-false statements, scalar judgments, nonsense sentences, filtered sentences, and transcription tasks. Out of an initial list of 90, we ended up with 36 true and 36 false statements for a total of 72. Each of these sentences was short, between 4 and 8 words, and syntactically simple. We only included sentences in which the truth value was easy to determine based on common and culture-independent knowledge, such as, elephants are big animals. We used 2 true, 2 true and 2 false sentences per speaker in our survey. Directly after the listeners determined the veracity of each true-false statement, they then completed the scalar rating. They were asked to use the slider scale to mark what percentage of the speaker's words they were able to understand. Understand was clarified as able to comprehend each word immediately, so that they didn't have to guess at the words. The scale ranged from 1 to 100. The next task was the nonsense sentences. Listeners would play the speech file and see something along these lines, a partial translation of the sentence with 4 blanks for missing content words. And I apologize, it looks like our boxes got a little offset there. They would have to type the 4 missing content words into the blank text boxes. Next came the filtered sentences. These required a little more preparation on our end. We used the software program Audacity to digitally manipulate the true-false sentences. To do this, first we selected 2 content words that we wanted to remain clear. Those were our target words. Then we blurred out the rest of the sentence. We applied a low-pass filter to make the non-target words sound distorted. In this example here, helmet and head were the clear words, and the rest of the sentence was muffled. Listeners were asked to type the 2 words that they had heard. Lastly, transcription. We again used our 72 true-false sentences for this task, but the sentences were presented in a random order, and this task was completed on a separate day. Listeners were simply asked to transcribe each sentence in its entirety. Then, as our comparison measure, we had 23 TOEFL listening passages provided by ETS. We pilot tested these on 45 participants, and MFRM led to the removal of 5 passages for a final total of 18. These 18 were distributed amongst our 18 speakers. During this process, we were careful to assign them so that each of the 6 World English varieties had passages that were similar in topic, task features, question types, and item difficulty. All of the passages were between 500 and 800 words, all simulated lectures delivered by a professor, and each passage concluded with 6 listening comprehension questions. We checked that all the listening passages fell into an accepted speech rate range, so that no one was significantly slower or faster than the others. We also performed some minor editing to make sure that there were no vocal disfluencies, such as coughs, and that the volume was sufficient and uniform between files. When all the files, both the listening comprehension passages and the sentences, were prepared for online rating, We carefully constructed a matrix that mixed the order of the speech stimuli and the tasks before embedding the files into the survey software. The listeners completed the listening comprehension and intelligibility measurements over 3 days. On day 1, they listened to each of the 18 listening passages, each read by a different speaker, and answered the corresponding listening comprehension questions. On day 2, listeners completed the true-false task, the scalar judgments, and the nonsense sentences. On day 3, they completed the filtered sentences and the transcriptions. We told participants that the survey may take up to 5 hours total, but we found that they were often able to complete it in less time. Listeners had to adhere to several rules. First, they were required to take the test over 3 separate days and had to complete each session in 1 sitting. They took the tests in computer labs with headphones. Each computer session was overseen by the researchers' contacts in those locations. Listener participation required quite an investment in time and energy, and because of this, the listeners were compensated monetarily for their participation. Here's a photo of a couple of listeners completing the survey in a computer lab with headphones. And here's an example listening comprehension passage. Listeners would play the file and then answer the corresponding questions. So we'll play a little bit of the file for you.
Most of you have probably been told at some time that St. Augustine, an old Spanish fort in Florida, was the first European settlement in what is now the United States. Actually, though, it wasn't the first.
For scoring, each correct answer on the true-false statements was awarded 1 point. Scalar judgments were converted to percentages so that a 60 out of 100 became a 60%. For the nonsense sentences, listeners could receive a score out of 4 for each of the content words they transcribed correctly. We didn't pay attention to spelling as long as the attempt was obvious. Also, because there were no contextual clues to signal the correct word grammatically, we accepted homophones. Similar to the nonsense sentences, listeners could get a score out of 2 for the filtered sentences. And lastly, transcription was measured as the number of correct words divided by the total number of words in the sentence. The speech was then evaluated extensively for fluency, stress and rhythm, intonation, and segmental features. We analyzed 8 fluency features: syllables per second, articulation rate, mean length of run, articulation time, number of silent pauses, both total and per second, length of silent pauses, both total and per second, unexpected pause ratio, which was defined as the percentage of pauses that were not in agreement with a baseline of 3 native speakers, and expected pause ratio, which was the percentage of pauses that were in agreement with the native speaker baseline. For stress and intonation features, we looked at instances of atypical primary word stress. So for example, if a speaker said rotate rather than rotate, number of prominent syllables per tone unit, length and location of prominent syllables, tone choice, whether it was rising, falling, or level, pitch height and pitch range, and rhythm. Lastly, for segmentals, a native speaker of Standard American English listened to each speech file and noted any and all segmental deviations from SAE. Deviations were then categorized according to the functional load theory. To analyze our findings statistically, we conducted linear mixed effects modeling. However, we excluded the transcription task from the analyses because the model was non-significant and transcription was only weakly associated with listener comprehension. And now Okim's going to talk to us about results.
Okay, thank you, Megan. The results is somewhat complicated, methodology-wise. So I'll try to share the simple ways as much as possible. Okay, so before we move on to the actual findings, we did a cluster analysis to reduce the number of phonological variables. Like Megan introduced, we got 13 more segmental deviations and fluency features and prosody features, so we had quite a bit. So these phonological variables were divided into 5 categories: segmental errors, negative positive fluency features, and negative positive prosody features. As you can see here, impeding features imply somewhat negative aspects, and enhancing features mean something positive. So for example, fast speech or speech rate was impeding fluency, but long stretch of speech like mean length of run or expected pauses versus unexpected, those belong to enhancing fluency. Also, we looked at the correlations among our 5 intelligibility measures. The results show that there was somewhat weak correlations among those 5 intelligibility measures, except for the transcription and filtered method, which revealed moderate to strong correlation 0.62. Okay, our first research question: how do phonological features contribute to each of our intelligibility measure? Like Megan said, the transcription method did not produce a significant model, so we will only talk about the first 4 intelligibility measures here. As for the true-false sentence method, fluency and prosody feature significantly predicted the intelligibility measure, but the vowel and the consonant errors or deviations did not contribute significantly. As for the nonsense measure, vowels and consonant errors was the strongest predictor, followed by enhancing fluency markers and impeding prosody markers. But the impeding fluency markers and enhancing prosody markers did not contribute significantly. As for the scalar judgment, listeners likely attended to all phonological characteristics. All phonological variables became significant predictors of the scalar ratings. This means that the scalar ratings generally overestimated the importance of various phonological deviations. As for the filtered speech, only vowels and consonant errors and the enhancing fluency markers significantly predicted the intelligibility score. Okay, so the overall results of the research question 1, phonological features were differently associated with each measure. The scalar rating method was the only approach that was significantly predicted by all 5 categories of the phonological variables. The impeding fluency and the enhancing prosody markers tended to predict most intelligibility measures, but the impact of a vowel and consonant errors were generally strong, but the effect of this variable on especially the true-false statements were relatively weak. Our second research question, we examined relationship between intelligibility measures and the listening comprehension scores. When we looked at our 18 speakers, 4 out of 5 measures significantly predicted the listening comprehension scores. Especially the nonsense sentence task was the strongest predictor, followed by the true-false statement task. Scalar judgments and filtered sentences were also significantly associated. But the transcription task, once again, did not predict the listening comprehension score significantly in this study. When we looked at the relationship with highly intelligible speakers only, nonsense sentence and the true-false statement task emerged as the strongest predictor, but none of the remaining intelligibility measures contributed significantly. This time we examined the least intelligible speakers only. In this case, nonsense sentence task again emerged as a significant predictor of the listening comprehension score, followed by the scalar rating method. The remaining 3 methods were not statistically significant. So the overall results of the research question 2, the most sensitive approaches to measuring intelligibility appear to be the nonsense sentence or the scalar judgment methods, especially the nonsense sentence method, we used in this study made the strongest contribution to the listening comprehension scores for all speakers. Okay, Ron will discuss these findings in more details and talk about their implications for teachers and researchers. Ron?
Thanks, Kim. So the relationship between 5 intelligibility measures were all significant, as we indicated, but weak in strength. And quantifiable features of this speech predicted the intelligibility scores, but the contribution of each cluster of features differed based on intelligibility measurement. So this seems to indicate that each intelligibility measurement taps into a slightly different construct. We found an association between intelligibility scores and phonological variables, the nonsense sentences, filtered sentences, and transcription methods in particular. These engage listeners' ability for sound recognition, which can be described as bottom-up phonemic level speech processing, and knowledge of sound co-occurrences. Listeners focus on the accuracy of each word and were more aware of the phonological features of the speech. The association between intelligibility scores and phonological variables with respect to true-false statements. The listeners were able to process the overall information of an utterance to get the gist. Background knowledge plus knowledge of word co-occurrences and individual phoneme identification was possible. There were some differences in phoneme production that may go unnoticed because of contextual cues, background knowledge, and because listeners appear not to be focused on word level intelligibility, segmental deviations did not seem to have as much of an impact. So which intelligibility measurement best predicts listeners' comprehension score? Well, our results suggest, at least for this group of speakers.
Ron,
Yep.
do you mind stopping for a second? I'll ask everyone to mute their microphones unless they're the presenters. I'll mute everyone and then I'll let you unmute yourself. Okay, Ron, you can unmute yourself. Let me help you with that.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Perfect. Yes, we can.
Great. So we were asking which intelligibility measurement best predicts listeners' listening comprehension scores, and as Kim already suggested in the results, the nonsense sentence approach seemed to be the best predictor.
Ron, excuse me. I'm seeing that the chat, people are asking if you wouldn't mind going back a little bit.
Okay.
A slide or two.
Okay, I'll go back to the true-false statements. Or let's go back, I guess, to nonsense sentences. So just to recap, what we found, as Kim suggested when she was discussing results, we found that nonsense sentences and filtered sentences and transcription methods were associated with intelligibility scores and phonological variables. This indicates that they engage listeners' ability for sound recognition, particularly bottom-up phonemic level of speech processing and knowledge of sound co-occurrence, and that listeners were focused on the accuracy of each word and were more aware of the phonological features of the speech. With respect to true and false statements, listeners were able to process the overall information of an utterance, and perhaps schema or background knowledge plus the knowledge of word co-occurrences and individual phoneme identification allowed this. There were some differences in phoneme production that may go unnoticed because of these contextual cues. And because listeners appeared not to be focused on word level intelligibility, segmental deviations did not seem to have as much of an impact. The question of which intelligibility measurement best predicts listeners' listening comprehension scores indicates that the nonsense sentence approach is the best predictor, at least for this type of speaker. It was the best indicator of intelligible speech for all 18 speakers, for the most comprehensible speakers, as well as for the least comprehensible speakers. The technique, although not widely used in the second language literature, is one of the most commonly used methods in speech-language pathology. The scalar rating technique emerged as a significant predictor for the low comprehensibility group, but not for the high comprehensibility group. So it may not be as useful a tool to screen out speakers for the purpose of developing test items. It could be that this is because there are more salient segmental divergences, and this is what the listeners were noticing, which in turn we know were a strong predictor. Filtered sentences and transcription were found to contribute some information, but their contribution was quite weak. The correlation between filtered sentence task and the transcription method was relatively strong. Participants could have readily guessed words without fully recognizing each of the speaker's phonemes. And the transcription method, which has often been used in the past, clearly needs further investigation. So, what are some implications for future research? This research study points to numerous implications for formal assessment as well as for pronunciation instruction. In formal assessment contexts, and in particular for tests of listening comprehension, it offers some possible techniques for pre-screening candidates who speak an outer or expanding circle variety of World English, in particular for use in listening material creation. Rather than recording stimulus speakers blindly and then spending resources validating what turns out to be inadequately intelligible English, potential candidates might first record nonsense sentences, the intelligibility of which can be used to predict their suitability for listening comprehension test material. But it's clear from this study that measures of intelligibility do not measure a unitary concept, so we must make decisions keeping in mind the intended purpose of the assessment. The use of intelligibility tasks should be used in combination with phonological analysis of speech to give the most accurate representation of a speaker's intelligibility. In fact, we've examined the use of these techniques to identify highly intelligible speakers for use in formal listening assessment contexts. So a study in which we again collaborated as part of this larger research program, we examined the effect of incorporating a variety of international English accents into a simulated TOEFL listening comprehension test in growing recognition of the internationalization of language teaching and learning in the field of TESOL. When the English produced as highly intelligible, listeners' comprehension test scores did not differ across different varieties of World Englishes. In another related study, we dug deeper into what underlying segmental and prosodic features contribute to listening comprehension difficulties for outer and expanding World English speakers. So in this paper, we report on an exploratory study that sought to determine what specific features of accented speech make it difficult for global listeners. We found divergences in high functional load vowels and consonants, that is, vowels and consonants, for those unfamiliar with the notion of functional load, vowels and consonants that lead to differences in meaning in the largest number of contexts. Consonant deletion, syllable reduction, and consonant cluster divergence. In function words, we found that segmental divergence from expected norms was found to be less egregious. The appropriate use of rising tone, tone unit, and rhythm clustered as important prosodic markers as well. Of course, a large study of this type is not without its limitations. For example, we really only investigated the intelligibility of high proficiency speakers and its relationship to listening comprehension performance by high proficiency listeners. We do not know if the same features that we found to contribute to intelligibility scores for these high proficiency speakers and listeners would be the same for low proficiency learners. Further, the texts were of a particular type, reflective of academic lectures. It's unclear whether intelligibility of speech produced by the same speakers would be higher or better in a more familiar genre, or if a more familiar genre were used. For example, narratives or personal information, for which background knowledge may make otherwise less intelligible speech decipherable. There were also some limitations to our methodology that may have impacted our results. So we do not control, for example, for listener familiarity with speaker varieties, which we know from previous research has an impact. The sentences that we used, sometimes we used for more than one task, so listeners may have developed familiarity with the text itself. And we deliberately used homogeneous speakers from each L1. That is, we looked for people that spoke the same variety of the L1. If it was South African English, for example, there are many varieties, but we isolated it to a single type of variety. So we might consider incorporating more linguistic diversity within each English variety. Since many of you are currently ESL instructors, you may be wondering what are some implications for the classroom, and these are really kind of preliminary thoughts on this topic. For classroom-based assessment, teachers might be advised to use the intelligibility scoring method that best predicts listening comprehension scores, if that is in fact the goal, the end goal for these learners. What were these? Well, we found production of nonsense sentences and true and false sentences were the best predictors, but definitely not scalar judgments or transcription tasks. If we're thinking about the focus of instruction, targeting segmentals and enhancing fluency, looking at things like mean length of run and features that impede prosody, such as pace, word stress deviation, and falling tone choice, will improve performance on nonsense sentence tasks, which we then suggest would improve performance in listening comprehension. And targeting fluency and prosody will improve performance on true-false tasks. What about world English contexts? What are the implications for teaching when we're not teaching in an inner circle country? Again, the results of this study seem applicable to academic English contexts where outer and expanding circle, whether outer and expanding circle or inner circle. What's less clear is whether these results are applicable to non-academic settings in outer and expanding circle contexts. There may be less of an issue with ambiguity of speech in interpersonal and business communication settings for world English speakers, for example. And as such, the relative weight of what features contribute to intelligibility might shift. When listeners are familiar with the topic and familiar with the speaker's accent, the bottom-up processing of the sort implicated in listening to an unfamiliar academic lecture may be less essential, and top-down processing may suffice to allow listeners to understand the point of a given speaker's message. Clearly, further research would be welcome to investigate these topics across contexts and in different spoken genres. This brings us to the end of our presentation. Kim, Megan, and I thank you for listening, and now we're open to questions.
Thank you so much. We can get the questions now, and I'll leave the floor to Megan.
Okay, I will be looking at the chat and trying to moderate the questions that come in. Okay, so here's a question. Were there any steps taken to mitigate any listener participants' non-attention, especially regarding true-false tasks? In other words, were there any sort of checks to see if they were not randomly clicking?
Megan, you could probably, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, you could probably add to this as well. But we conducted this study in 3 days, day 1, day 2, day 3, just like Megan described. And these intelligibility measures were presented to our listeners, counter order. So one day we did a transcription with some listeners. Second day we did the true false with another listeners. So it's not like everything was presented in the same order. And also all of this, we actually paid listeners $120. So we paid them quite a bit of money. And it was only 10 listeners per country. So each listener was very strictly controlled. They came, just like the picture that Megan shared, each listener came to the computer lab and there was a proctor made an observations for every single performance because it was such a high stake, high paid task. They knew it was supposed to be a serious job, and we believed that they performed at their best ability. However, we didn't really double check in terms of true false statement, whether they answering it seriously or just randomly, but roughly everyone spent about the same amount of time, and we believe that it was very seriously considered. Megan, do you want to add anything to it?
No, I think that you pretty much covered it. I do want to apologize in advance that I won't be able to get to everyone's questions, but I did see another one here that I especially liked, and that was, how might the non-sentence tasks be incorporated into a pronunciation lesson?
Ron, do you want to add something first? Do you want to say something, or should I start first?
Why don't you go ahead and let me think about this for a second.
So after this project, we started with 72 nonsense statements. It actually, we got these statements directly from speech synthesis project team at MIT. So we had more than 200 statements to start with. Then we kind of chose 72 sentences only. Then based on this project, we ended up selecting 32 sentences to use. We didn't include that in the journal, but actually that's something we could share easily if anyone is interested. And I don't think as a teacher in the classroom, you can use all those 32 sentences, but introducing a couple. The idea is, as you could see for the nonsense statement results, the segmental deviation makes a big difference. It really encourages our learners to focus on the clear enunciation. So if we just introduce a few sentences as a task, as an activity, and as a pair work, as a group work, and let them try to read a sentence. I actually tried it with some of our MA TESOL students, just an activity to introduce. And it actually brings up a lot of fun because people don't understand the meaning of it. So they try to repeat the sentence, and they seem to be aware of the importance of the clear enunciation. So that's probably what I would suggest. Ron, do you want to?
Yeah, I guess I'll add to this, and just something that I've thought about a lot is that listening instruction, in my opinion, seems to be biased towards kind of top-down processing. There's an assumption made that I guess second language learners aren't going to be that good at bottom-up processing, so they can compensate by doing top-down processes. And I think that what nonsense sentences could do, even if you did pair work, for example, if you had two students producing nonsense sentences controlled for word frequency, they should be words, the words in the sentences should be words that they're familiar with, I would think. But if they produce these nonsense sentences and then the other member of the pair is asked to transcribe them, I think that could contribute to the development of bottom-up processing, because they would be able to kind of figure out where the communication broke down for the speaker. And these are the types of tasks that native speakers don't generally have a big problem doing, and non-native speakers do. So I think that there could be some pedagogical benefit in kind of decontextualizing listening material in a way that's not done very often.
And also, one more thing that I want to add is I tried this particular method with low proficiency non-native speakers. Because like we said, we only used highly proficient listeners first. Their TOEFL scores was like 100 or 110 out of 112, 120. So they were extremely highly proficient. But when I tried this method with non-native speakers who who are more like intermediate or beginners, they had a hard time completing this task. First of all, nothing made sense. Second, they could not guess any possible word. So we are not suggesting that this is the only good intelligibility measure. Just like Ron said in the discussion session, intelligibility itself is a complicated construct, and there are many different ways of measuring it. Just introducing this particular method once in a while seems to bring some kind of awareness of the importance of the bottom-up approach or the clear enunciations. But once again, we are not saying this is the only useful method that we need to practice.
So another question is there a way to examine in your data whether the number of unexpected pauses in the lecture or speech impacted comprehension? Do you have any insights about this? And I will say that that's one area that I am working with right now. So hopefully—
Megan, you could say something about that.
Well, I think it's to be seen right as of now, but hopefully at PSLLT next year, that will be a presentation.
That was actually a study that we proposed to the PSLLT 2020, but it's going to be 2021 at Brock University.
I think one issue which was a limitation in this study is probably that, I mean, as we said in the method section, the speech rate of these things was kept relatively homogeneous.
Yes.
Which means there may not be a lot of variability. So I think it's an important question in more natural kind of lecture material, for example. And there might be something there, but I think my recollection in collecting some of these recordings was that if we didn't like the way somebody produced the lecture, we would, like if their speech rate wasn't quite right, we would ask them to do a second take and make sure they were homogeneous. So it's not completely authentic, but there might be something there. I could imagine that there would be something there in more naturalistic kind of production.
Ron, there is a related question about PSLLT. Someone asked, what is happening with the August PSLLT? Is it being pushed forward?
Yeah, so if you go to the Google PSL 2020, you'll find on the website an announcement about that. I didn't want to bombard people with more emails with cancellations if they hadn't submitted an abstract or indicated that they were planning on attending PSLs in 2020. So those two groups of people should have received an email from me. If you didn't, check your junk mail. But if you're not one of those groups of people, the website is the place to look, and we're moving it to the middle of June in 2021. Unfortunately, or fortunately for some, it's going to be June, not August, because Brock University's campus is not available in August next year.
And it looks like the link is now in the chat as well to the website.
Yeah, thank you.
Also, I want to give a chance for anyone who is called in to ask any questions, if we have anyone in that category.
One thing I'd like to share is when it comes to speaker selection, we spent about 9-10 months to find those 18 speakers. We chose 18 speakers, but the people we studied with, Megan, would be like 82 so much speakers we tried out because finding the right intelligibility level for each different variety was one of the most challenging tasks of this project that I want to share. So do we get any questions?
We still have time if you want to get a few more questions, Megan.
Okay. If there are no questions for calling in yet, it looks like Isabel Darcy has another question about the nonsense task.
Yes, what is the question?
It's coming, sorry. Just a moment. And actually, while I wait for that, let me see if I've missed any others.
Somebody asked to clarify the difference between comprehensibility and intelligibility. that's always an important thing to clarify because it's often confused in the literature. So let's just say this, that comprehensibility is often confused with comprehension, which it isn't. And comprehensibility refers to how much effort a listener perceives that they're making. Usually it's measured using a scalar judgment. So how much effort they feel that they're making cognitively to process accented speech. And intelligibility has to do with whether they understand it or not. So one is effort and processability, the other one is understanding.
And in this study, we looked at comprehension.
Right.
For that purpose, listeners actually took the listening comprehension test.
Which comprehension in many cases is kind of the same as intelligibility. It's a crude measure of intelligibility.
Okay, here's a sort of a two-part question. I wondered about whether you included stress errors on the nonsense words, as well as if there were some stress errors on the nonsense words, and whether the various types of mispronunciations in that task could be unpacked to see if there's a relationship between these and the comprehension scores or transcription scores on that task.
That's a great question, but let me see the examples of nonsense here. As we introduced, all these nonsense words were, Megan, was one.
They were all, yeah, no, for the nonsense. I believe that they were all monosyllabic.
Yeah, one syllable.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, these are true, false.
I think you just had the nonsense a second ago. Yeah.
Yeah, but we don't. Yeah, but all these nonsense words are one syllable, monosyllabic words, intentionally. So that's a possibility, and we could also look at the prominence rather than lexical stress and the relationship between this prominence and the intelligibility scores or listeners' comprehension, but we haven't looked at that part yet for this project.
It looks like we only have a couple more minutes. So there was another question I saw here about whether the nonsense task would fit best into a lesson on consonant and vowel articulation rather than stress and rhythm, or not necessarily. So people are still interested in the application of these tasks in the classroom.
So when I try this particular activity with my students, because they were supposed to fill in the blank, or even the partner, the listeners can transcribe the entire nonsense sentence. Either way, the issue I found is it's not necessarily the rhythm and the stress, the lexical issues were coming into play. Mostly the each sound enunciation was the focus of listeners, I noticed. So the listener asked the other partner, the speaker, to slow down and try to say more clearly, but it's still a difficult word because nothing makes sense. So my impression is, because this is a bottom-up approach, which eliminates a bit of the suprasegmental aspects, we probably need to just focus on the segmental parts of vowels and consonants rather than the stress and rhythm. But if we are using the same sentence, like a more like a I keep hearing some noise, I'm sorry, some kind of repetition practice, then maybe we can talk about the rhythm and prominence issues. But that's only for the case that they repeat the same sentence again and again. But the very first attempt, I noticed students are focusing on the single segmental aspect to better understand the word, to try to figure out what is really happening in the sentence. I'll try to see why the noise is coming.
There might be someone else's mic being on and there's something on their computer.
All right, so is there any other questions that you want to get, Megan? Or
Other people had questions. I would love to be able to get to them all, but I think time-wise, we're just not able to, and I apologize for that.
There's
Right.
one here. There is one here from Wilco French about how do we measure what the sort of impact on listener cumulative effect, really the cumulative effect of errors and fatigue, frustration impact that it has on listeners beyond intelligibility. So again, this goes back to the distinction between intelligibility and comprehensibility, this distinction that's been made by Monroe and Derwing and Monroe in many different studies. And that is that intelligibility could be what we're looking at sentence by sentence. Do listeners understand what they're listening to? Comprehensibility is a higher standard because really over the duration of a text, if you're putting in more effort, you feel like you're putting in more effort to listen to something, that's going to cause fatigue. And so those kind of scalar judgments are certainly useful in measuring the effect of fatigue, I would say.
And
All
one more thing, Sinem. People are asking if the recording will be available
Yes.
afterwards. And
Yes, the recording will be available in a few days. I'll be sharing the link of the video with all participants. It will be actually on TESOL's YouTube channel, so I'll just make sure that you get the link. Well, I think this brings us to the end of the presentation. I would like to thank you all because this was our very first SPLIS webinar and you guys agreed to do it with all of us, and I'm sure everybody enjoyed the presentation. And thank you to everyone who participated to our very first webinar. And this is the end of our webinar, and you may disconnect now.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Okim. Thank you so much, Megan and Ron. This was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you for putting it together for us.
Thanks.